Good morning. I'm going to say a few words about Psalm 88. Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. I am overwhelmed with troubles and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down into the pit. I am like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily on me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have taken from me my closest friends, and have made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call to you, Lord, every day. I spread out my hands to you. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do their spirits rise up and praise you? Is your love declared in the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the place of darkness, or your righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? But I cry to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I have suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken from me friend and neighbour. Darkness is my closest friend. I have read this psalm several times, and each time I have heard something different. But my initial reaction was, oh gosh, what can I say about this psalm that helps at all? It is very much a plea for help, a plea about feeling abandoned, and yet there is still faith. It reminds me of many people over the years, people who have been persecuted for their faith, people who have felt totally abandoned by God and friends, people who have no idea of where else to go. I was watching a couple of programmes about the Black Death recently. They must have felt a bit like this. Their cries to God must have been these cries. The different wars and their consequences, people must have cried out like this. And in recent history, this still resonates. Think of those affected in any way in the Holocaust. How abandoned they must have felt. Think of Afghanistan and the people there. And although my knowledge is tiny on this, I have heard my son talk about his time there. Think of Ukraine and those people, what they are feeling about what has happened and is continuing to happen. They must cry out like this. And I include those who are protesting against the war in many countries, including Russia. We need to face these uncomfortable times in our lives. I personally have faced very uncomfortable times in my life when I have asked some of these questions of God. But I do not compare myself to the situations I have mentioned at all. But I do know about being abandoned by someone I thought was a close friend, who decided very suddenly I was no longer a friend, and that particularly resonated with me. I have felt in the lowest pit and the darkest depths many times in my life because of my mental health struggles. This psalm seems unique when compared to other psalms of lament. God seems not to hear, not to speak, not even to be present. I cannot imagine how that must feel. Because even in my darkest hours, I have always believed God is there. Christ is with me. But then if we read this psalm again, I think the psalmist thinks this also. Otherwise, why does he continue to cry out? Why does he still plead? This psalm is a desperate cry of someone who needs to continue to cry to God. It is also a psalm that is considered by some an embarrassment to our Christian faith, not one to be used. That is, it is too bleak. And yet that is exactly what makes it one of the most meaningful prayers ever uttered. It is attributed to the sons of Korah and an individual in particular named Heman the Ezrahite, who was chosen by David and served under King Solomon and was apparently considered a very wise man. But it is obvious that the writer finds himself in the midst of a terrible crisis. This is a heart-wrenching cry of someone at the end of his tether. He is feeling hopeless, and that is an awful feeling, to feel you have no hope at all. And he has felt this since a young age. There is a feeling that he is completely separated from God, and yet he calls out to God every day. His hands are lifted in supplication, yet in these depths of despair he is not silenced. How many times have you heard someone asks, why does God not answer my prayer? And yet here is someone who is asking that same thing, but is still calling, still pleading to God. This should be a message to us, that even when God does seem distant or not even there, we should keep calling, keep pleading, keep crying out to him. I want to suggest that this psalm provides a good dose of realism. Life is unpredictable. Think of 15 months ago. Think of 3 years ago. Who would have imagined COVID and all its after effects? Who would have imagined a war in Europe? Life can be extremely harsh and unforgiving. This psalm faces all those things. It faces the fact that unlike films and TV programmes, life does not always have a happy ending, or at least what we consider a happy ending. This psalm has no answers, but it does have faith. The psalmist does not stop. He keeps praying. He has not abandoned his belief in God. Some people might use this psalm to state that it does appear to be a loss of faith, but I would argue it does the opposite. If anyone continues to pray, to talk to God, regardless of whether they think they are being heard or not, then I would suggest that is real faith, that there is a God. Otherwise, why keep pleading? Why keep crying out to God? Walter Brueggemann, in his message of the Psalms, said, one has two options, either to wait in silence or to speak it again. What one may not do is to rush to an easier psalm or give up on Yahweh. Human nature may lead us to find something more comfortable. We may question, where is God? But we do have a choice, just like the psalmist does. We can keep crying out, we can keep talking, keep pleading, and especially we can keep listening. In fact, it is in times like these that we need especially to keep listening, because whatever we may feel, whatever this psalmist feels, God is there. We need to hear him, whatever he may say to us, and that is the uncomfortable part. And despite his obscurity, Heman's wisdom, service and faithfulness to God were not forgotten, either by the Levites or the people and God whom he served. Let us remember the faithful example of Heman and recognise that we are not forgotten by God, even when it may seem like that. Ben told me that in Caiaphas' house, where Jesus was kept in a pit before his trial, the words of this psalm are written about this house. One of the things I thought when I read this psalm was these are the words of Jesus when he was taking part in the Last Supper with his disciples and was telling them that he was about to be betrayed by one of them. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when he asked to be spared, while he was imprisoned, and on the cross, the ultimate cry for help. And yet he knew God was there. He knew God was suffering with him, walking with him, just as God does with us today, through the pain, the anguish, the uncertainty. He is there when we question his presence, ready to forgive and bring us back into his arms. What we have to do is to keep praying and to keep listening for what might seem to be a very small voice at times.